When you buy oil, anywhere in the world, you pay for it in US dollars. When airlines buy jet fuel in Tokyo, London, or Sao Paulo, they pay in US dollars. When farmers in Argentina sell soybeans to buyers in China, the transaction is settled in US dollars. When a Vietnamese company imports machinery from Germany, the invoice is in US dollars. The US dollar is present in almost 90% of all currency transactions on Earth. It underpins the entire global financial system. And most people have no idea how it got there, or what happens to their own money if that ever changes. Today, Coin Explained breaks it all down. How the dollar got its power. What that power actually means. Who is trying to challenge it? And what would really happen if the dollar's reign came to an end? How the dollar became the world's reserve currency. To understand how the dollar took over the world, we need to go back to the summer of 1944. World War II was still being fought, but its outcome was becoming clear. Allied leaders knew they needed to build a new global financial order for the peace that would follow. Representatives from 44 countries gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Over 3 weeks, they designed the financial architecture that would govern the world economy for the next half-century. The deal they made was simple but enormously consequential. Every country would peg its currency to the US dollar. And the US dollar itself would be pegged to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This made the dollar the anchor of the entire global system. Why the dollar? Because in 1944, the United States was the dominant economic power on Earth. It held approximately 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Its economy was the only major one that had not been destroyed by the war. And its military was the most powerful. The dollar was, by any reasonable measure, the world's most trustworthy currency. In 1971, as we mentioned in the gold video, President Nixon ended the gold backing. The dollar was no longer redeemable for gold. It became what economists call a fiat currency, backed by nothing except trust in the US government and economy. By rights, this should have ended dollar dominance. Why trust a currency backed by nothing? The answer is what happened next. The petrodollar system and how it locked in dollar dominance. After Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, the United States needed a new way to maintain demand for its currency globally. The solution came from an unlikely place: oil. In 1974, the US government struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. In exchange for US military protection and a guaranteed supply of American weapons, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars, and to invest its surplus oil revenues in US Treasury bonds. The other OPEC nations quickly followed. Almost overnight, the petrodollar system was born. Every country in the world that needed to buy oil, which was effectively every country in the world, needed to hold US dollars to do it. This created a permanent, structural global demand for the dollar that replaced the gold standard as the foundation of dollar dominance. The system worked brilliantly for the United States for 50 years. Countries accumulated dollar reserves. They bought US Treasury bonds, effectively lending money to the American government at low interest rates. The US could run trade deficits and borrow cheaply because the world always needed dollars. That system is now under serious pressure for the first time since it was created. In 2023, Saudi Arabia began accepting yuan, Chinese currency, for some oil sales to China. The petrodollar monopoly, which had held for nearly 5 decades, cracked. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their partners now settle approximately 67% of intra-block trade in local currencies, up from under 20% just a decade ago. The extraordinary privileges the dollar gives America. Before we talk about what happens if this changes, let's understand just how much power dollar dominance gives the United States. The first privilege is cheap borrowing. Because the world needs dollars, there is always demand for US Treasury bonds, meaning the US government can borrow money more cheaply than any other country on Earth. This has allowed America to run massive budget deficits for decades without the consequences that would cripple another nation. The second privilege is what economists call seigniorage, the profit a country makes from issuing currency. When the world holds $7.4 trillion in dollar-denominated reserves, the US essentially gets to use other countries' resources in exchange for pieces of paper it prints. It is a privilege no other country in history has enjoyed at this scale. The third, and most powerful privilege, is financial weaponry. The United States can cut any country off from the global financial system simply by removing access to dollar transactions. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the US and its allies froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, assets held in dollars and euro-denominated accounts. Russia could not access its own money. This was an act of financial warfare without a single bullet being fired. That moment sent a clear message to every government watching. Holding your wealth in dollars is a geopolitical vulnerability. If your relationship with Washington deteriorates, your reserves can be frozen. The response, as we saw in the gold video, has been a rapid shift toward gold and away from dollar-denominated assets. De-dollarization. Who is walking away and why? De-dollarization is the gradual reduction of the world's dependence on the US dollar. And in 2026, the data confirms it is accelerating. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from a peak of 72% in 2001 to 56.9% in late 2025, the lowest level since 1995. And here is the number that tells the real story. When gold is included in total reserve calculations, which the IMF traditionally excludes, the dollar's share of global reserves falls below 47%. For the first time in decades, the dollar accounts for less than half of what the world's central banks are holding. By the end of 2025, central bank gold holdings reached $5.2 trillion in value, exceeding the $3.7 to $4 trillion in US Treasury bonds held by foreign central banks. Gold, for the first time, has overtaken US debt as the world's most held reserve asset outside of dollars. China has been building an alternative payments infrastructure, the CIPS system, which processes billions of dollars in transactions daily and is designed to bypass the dollar entirely. Russia developed its own alternative after being cut off from SWIFT. The BRICS bloc, which now represents 48.5% of the world's population and over 40% of global GDP, is actively working on mechanisms for trade that do not require dollars. None of this means the dollar is about to collapse. It remains by far the dominant global currency. The euro, the next largest reserve currency, accounts for only around 20% of reserves. There is no ready replacement, but the direction of travel is clear, and it has been clear for 20 years. What happens if the dollar loses its status? This is the question that makes economists nervous, because the honest answer is that nobody really knows. It has never happened before in the modern era. If the dollar gradually loses its reserve currency status, not overnight, but over decades, the consequences would be profound. The US would lose its ability to borrow cheaply. Interest rates on American debt would rise. The cost of financing the $38 trillion national debt would become significantly more expensive. The US government would have to make difficult choices. It has been able to avoid for decades, cutting spending, raising taxes, or accepting higher inflation. The dollar's value would weaken relative to other currencies. American consumers would pay more for imported goods. The cost of living would rise. The extraordinary standard of living that cheap global borrowing has helped sustain would face pressure. For the rest of the world, a weaker dollar would mean cheaper imports from the US, but also more volatile global financial markets as the anchor currency loses stability. And here is where it connects to everything this channel covers. A world searching for a new neutral reserve asset, something that is not controlled by any single government, cannot be frozen or sanctioned, and has a fixed supply, is a world that starts looking very seriously at both gold and Bitcoin. That is not speculation. It is the logic that is already driving central bank gold purchases and institutional crypto adoption simultaneously. The dollar is not dying. But the era of unquestioned dollar dominance is quietly ending. And the world that comes next is the world this channel is designed to help you understand. The dollar became the world's reserve currency through a combination of economic dominance, geopolitical deal-making, and the trust of every nation that needed to trade globally. That trust is still there, but it is being tested, and the alternatives are getting stronger. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Next week on Coin Explained, we are going deep on inflation. What it actually is, why it is described as a silent tax, and how it has been quietly stealing your purchasing power for your entire life. See you there.